Hello everyone, and welcome to this short lecture on environmental nutrition. So in these first couple of slides, we'll explore what this definition of environmental nutrition is. Here's probably the most concise definition of it. So environmental nutrition, rather than just looking specifically at individual nutrition, kind of looks at three aspects together. Those three aspects are the total food supply, health, which would be health of the environment, health of all animals involved in the food supply, both human and other species, and health of the food being produced. And then the third component being the total physical environment. So just to kind of compare traditional nutrition and environmental nutrition, because obviously in these lectures we've focused a lot on what we'll define as the traditional nutrition this morning. So broadening that view of nutrition, or broadening that definition of nutrition to include these other components of food production, the environment, and physical health. So in traditional nutrition, we kind of focus on measurable components of food, the calories, the vitamins, the fats, the proteins, the carbohydrates, etc. And again, stuff we've basically focused on so far in this class. Traditional nutrition also focuses on just a single person. So oftentimes when we're talking about nutritional health, we talk about it on the individual level. So how is that person's nutritional health? How is my own nutritional health? How is my sister's nutritional health? And so on. And then finally, in the traditional nutrition framework, we're kind of discussing the health qualities of the food, or these specific nutrient qualities of food, as sort of separate from how the food is produced and how the food is consumed. So often we just sort of assume that all apples have a certain amount of vitamin C, or that all apples are going to affect our body in the same way, regardless of how they've been produced, and where in the food system they sort of intersected us at the time of eating them. So environmental nutrition basically explores all of those things that traditional nutrition does not. So environmental nutrition considers the entire food system. That includes the social aspects of the food system, the economic aspects of the food system, and the environmental aspects of the food system, rather than just saying the individual nutrition of a person. In the environmental nutrition approach or framework or perspective, we would also then aim to conserve and renew natural resources, rather than just identifying natural resources like nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, the three most common minerals used in fertilizing gardens and farms, rather than just saying, okay, these things exist in the earth now and we can mine them now. We would look at these things and say, okay, there's a limited supply of these things in the earth, and so how can we develop our food systems and our farming practices so that we are conserving these nutrients as much as possible, using just the bare minimum that we need to get by right now, and finding ways to renew their bioavailability for us. We would also consider natural resources like water, fresh water, timber, forests, biodiversity of animals and insects, bees, for example. In addition to conserving and renewing natural resources, the environmental nutrition approach would aim to advance social justice. So we'll see on the next lecture how there's sort of pretty tremendous social inequality in our food production system. Well, we won't get into it too much in this course, but hopefully it goes without saying there's pretty tremendous animal welfare issues in our current food supply. Just Google CAFO, concentrated animal feeding operation, or just Google animal agriculture. Google any documentaries on the current food system, and you'll start to get some insight into the pretty horrific animal agriculture approach. So environmental nutrition would aim to improve the well-being of all animals involved in the food system. Environmental nutrition would also focus on community wealth, so wealth at like the local level or the regional level rather than the wealth of the few businesses involved in the entire global food supply. And then environmental nutrition, lastly, would seek to fulfill the nutrition needs and the food needs of humans, not only right now in the present, but would also consider the future. And again, with the second bullet, conserving and renewing natural resources, and with all these bullets, this last piece kind of pulls it together. How can we produce food now in a way that provides food now, but also conserves all the resources we use to produce food so that food can be available for people in the future? And so then just kind of a third slide pulling this all together. So environmental nutrition sort of sits at the intersection of, yes, individual health, but then also community health. So how healthy is the community? How vital, how productive, how happy is the community in which we live? And then also how healthy is the ecosystem? We can talk about our hyper-local ecosystems, again, kind of at the community level, but in community, we often only think of human beings. So sort of the entire natural ecosystem that exists around our community that allows our community to live. But then we can also think about sort of continent-wide ecosystems, and then we can talk about the entire global ecosystem. So environmental nutrition kind of has a very big job to do in terms of pulling all of these three things together and making sure that all three of these things are sort of optimal at their best. So in this slide, we'll just kind of look at some of the impacts on health, human health, as well as ecosystem health, environmental health, kind of based on what's currently going on. So currently, the U.S. diet, the common diet in the United States, remains to be very high in fats, very high in added sugars, very low in nutrients, micronutrients like vitamins and minerals, not very high in water, and relatively low in our other macronutrients like, well, depending on where you are, it may be high in protein, but not very rich in the macronutrients coming from whole, unadulterated, unprocessed foods. So the current U.S. diet is very high in processed foods and therefore added sugar, added salt, added fat. So with that, the impacts then on health are a number of our most common chronic diseases right now: obesity, diabetes, cardiovascular disease, cognitive decline, dementia, neurodegenerative disorders, and cancers. So again, these are sort of newer diseases, at least we're having such a tremendous frequency and incidence. This kind of parallels the modern food system. The increased incidence of these diseases parallels the development of the modern food system. And then on the other side, we can look at how the food system has affected environmental health. So again, kind of looking over the past 50 to 100 years, we see that we have pretty tremendously increased air and water pollution. We have increased exposure to toxic chemicals, both at the environmental level and at the human level for people involved working in the food system and or living near areas of immense industrial food production. We're seeing a pretty big increase in antibiotic-resistant bacteria, that should say, bacteria, again, largely coming from the antibiotics used in animal agriculture, so given to animals in these concentrated animal feeding operations because they're basically penned in these tiny cells and not really, their bodies don't really develop an ability to have a healthy immune system. So these animals are very susceptible to disease, and then they live in tight quarters where disease spreads rapidly. So antibiotics have been used pretty heavily in the industrial food system, and then that gets into our food supply and that gets into our waterways. And so bacteria are smart, and they've figured out a way to become resistant to a lot of our common antibiotics, at least in the food system sector. Soil erosion. So again, large agricultural systems tend to erode the soil, and then similarly tend to emit a lot of greenhouse gases. And with our methods of agriculture, we are losing tremendous amounts of biodiversity, and we're currently in one of the largest mass extinction of species that the world has ever experienced. So it's pretty profound how rapidly humans basically are wiping out other species of not only land animals, but also water animals. So just to not be such a Debbie Downer, let's talk about a few things that could be positive too. So again, if our entire food system were to switch to a more environmental nutrition model, these are some of the benefits we might see. And of course, where methods of agriculture that are much more sustainable and kind of consider the environmental nutrition approach, we already see these benefits in action. So a nourishing diet, not just the standard American diet, but a truly nourishing diet would provide for that individual a healthy body weight, a healthy body, healthy digestive system, healthy organs, bones, teeth, healthy mind, overall reduced risk of all diseases. Also would improve health for the next generation. So again, thinking about reproduction, if a child is being conceived, if the two parents contributing to that child are in very good health, then that child has a much greater likelihood of coming out healthy. But again, if those two parents contributing to making that child are not well, then that child, what does that child have to go off of to become well itself? So the health of the parents in reproduction tremendously impacts the health of the offspring. Again, sort of mental health, so improved overall mood, increased memory, and improved sleep. And then on the environmental level, a sustainable food system would allow for continued natural resources, food, water, forests, air, soil, minerals in the soil, pollination, pollinators, animals, resilience to natural disasters, healthier ecosystems overall, and then just lower total impact on climate change. So just I think I have a couple slides here of examples, again, kind of comparing traditional nutrition to environmental nutrition, if this isn't sort of coming together yet, but hopefully it is. So again, in traditional nutrition, we might sort of look at, in a very isolated fashion, okay, we've sort of identified that omega-3 fats are very good for us and that fatty fish are a great source of these omega-3 fatty acids. Having no concept of the health of fish in their greater ecosystem, either the health of the fish or the health of the entire ecosystem. Right? If we just look at the isolated nutrient, say, okay, get it from the salmon, but we have no concept of the health of salmon populations or the health of oceans, this perspective has its blinders on in a big way. So environmental nutrition then would say, okay, yes, omega-3 fats are good for human health, but let's look at fisheries around the world and notice that actually fisheries around the globe are collapsing because of unsustainable fishing practices and unsustainable high rates of fishing. We're literally pulling all the fish out of the ocean, and we are literally destroying tons of other marine animals in the process of selecting a few fish that we eat: salmon, tuna, mackerel, cod, halibut. Those aren't the only fish that exist in the ocean, right? And so again, if we actually consider the entire food system that goes into bringing a salmon to our plate, we might notice, oh, that's causing a lot of trouble for the environment at large. Maybe I'll reconsider where I get my omega-3 fats, and I'll look to other food sources of omega-3 fats that are having a lesser negative impact on the overall environment. So that's sort of one difference, one way to sort of consider that difference between traditional nutrition and environment. And then again, let's talk about apples, for example. So in traditional nutrition, we might say, okay, how much vitamin C does an apple provide? How many calories, how much fiber? Without ever considering the dozens of different types of apples, where the apple was grown, when it was harvested, when it was transported from the farm, the orchard, to the site of consumption, right? Or if we really explore that chain from the orchard to the processing plant to the retail operation, and then we go buy it at that retail store, the grocery store, and then we take it to our house. But where do we even eat it? Do we eat it at our house? Do we eat it in the car? Do we eat it at our job, at school? So environmental nutrition would ask some of these questions and then some. But rather than saying, okay, how much vitamin C is in an apple, we would say, how was that apple grown? Was it grown with pesticides and synthetic fertilizers that we know are having a negative impact on ecosystems? What about the people involved in growing the apple, right? The apple didn't just walk from the orchard to the grocery store so we could pick it up. There are tons of people involved in the food supply and the food chain, food production chain. So how are they? Are they well? Are they paid well? Are they healthy? Are they not sick? Right. What about the people involved in the food production? If the apple was grown with pesticides and fertilizers, what is the impact on the farmer who has to spray those pesticides? Or what is the impact on the person who has to harvest the apples from the tree if it's been sprayed with pesticides and fertilizers? And then what about the packaging? We don't think about this so much with apples, but maybe you do. Maybe you've noticed sometimes at the grocery store, a lot of fruits and vegetables are pretty waxy on the outside. So that doesn't come from the apple tree, right? Usually the grocery manufacturer has covered it with wax to help keep it from spoiling too fast. So what about that? And then if it's not just an apple, or sometimes it is, sometimes you see them bagged up in plastic bags, right? Or you'll get all these lettuces now come in these plastic boxes with the little plastic layer on top to keep it sealed in and fresh. So what about all this? How is this impacting not just my health, the end consumer, but how is this impacting ecosystem health at large? And again, how is this impacting all the other people involved in this food production pathway? And then I think this is the last slide for this presentation, but kind of how can we transition then from this traditional nutrition perspective, which really just focuses on the single person, and move to a more environmental approach, which looks at sort of our collective responsibility to not only take care of ourselves, but take care of each other, take care of all animals, and take care of the entire ecosystem at large, so that we're not just sort of destroying it just to exist now in the present, right? How can we sort of take a longer term perspective on all this? So again, traditional nutrition, very individualistic, would be focusing on, okay, I'm going to eat broccoli and blueberries because they're rich in antioxidants and I'm going to have a reduced risk of cancer. But in the environmental nutrition approach, we'd look at that whole system. How is the broccoli grown? How are the blueberries grown? How are the farm workers who grew those? How are the people involved in harvest, production, processing, packaging, transportation? How are they? How is the ecosystem in which all this is happening? So the entire system of food production in the environmental nutrition approach is shaped by public policy, agribusiness practices, cultural values. We would think about things like pesticide use, the toxins in the food production and the transportation and the packaging. We would think about the degradation of lands and ecosystems like soil erosion, we would think about these things and say, okay, how can we do better? How can we make it so that these things aren't happening? We would think about the greenhouse gas emissions and say, we can probably do this without emitting so much greenhouse gas. So sort of shifting how we think in terms of nutrition. Yes, it's important to take care of ourselves, and traditional nutrition is important, but how can we think of that within this larger context of the entire system so that we're not just taking care of ourselves, but every time we choose to eat something, we're considering the larger impact on the total environment and on the total system involved.